People think change always begins with a dramatic moment, a confession, a discovery, a door opening, and a whole new life waiting on the other side. But for me, it was never like that. There was no lightning strike, no grand rebellion, no day when I looked in the mirror and suddenly understood everything. What happened to me was quieter than that, slower, more private. It began as a way to survive. When I was young, life felt like a hallway where every sound echoed. Expectations came from everywhere. Family, school, neighbors, strangers, television, the air itself. There was always a right way to stand, a right way to speak, a right way to laugh, a right way to move your hands. Even before I had words for myself, I knew I was being measured. Not in a cruel, obvious way all the time. Sometimes it came wrapped in advice. Sometimes in concern. Sometimes in jokes that everyone else treated like nothing. But when you are young, you learn quickly that nothing can still leave a bruise. I became careful early. Careful with posture. Careful with my face. Careful with what I admired and how long I looked at it. I learned to monitor myself from the outside, as if I were both the child and the guard standing beside him. That kind of self-surveillance becomes exhausting before you even know it has a name. It turns ordinary days into performances. It teaches you that safety comes from control, not comfort. Loneliness grew in that gap. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that makes for cinematic scenes in the rain. Mine was practical. Functional. I went to school. I answered questions. I did what I was supposed to do. I was there, technically. But inside, I was becoming someone who relied on quiet corners and invisible rituals just to feel whole. I did not yet think of it as femininity. I did not call it crossdressing. I did not call it identity. I only knew that softness felt medicinal. I remember noticing little things first. The way certain fabrics seemed to ask less from the body. The way neatness could feel like dignity instead of duty. The way small acts of care could lower the volume of panic inside my chest. Folding clothes carefully. Washing my face slowly at night. Brushing lint from a sleeve. Straightening a room no one else would enter. These were tiny gestures, almost laughably ordinary, but they gave me something the rest of life did not. Gentleness without explanation. That is how the mindset began. Not as fantasy. Not as theater. Not as some sudden desire to become someone else. It started as a private agreement with myself. If the world insisted on being hard, I would not help it harden me further. I would create softness where I could. I would move more carefully in private than I was allowed to in public. I would treat my own loneliness with the kind of tenderness no one had taught me how to ask for. In those years, clothing became less about appearance and more about permission. Permission to exhale. Permission to stop bracing every muscle as if I were waiting for impact. Sometimes it was something simple, hidden, and unremarkable to anyone else. A smoother texture. A more delicate routine. The order mattered as much as the garments did. Washington fold. Arrange. Choose.
Sit down. Breathe.
It was not about transformation in the dramatic sense. It was about reducing friction between who I felt like inside and how I was forced to exist all day. I think that is what many people misunderstand. They imagine change as an act of escape, but often it is an act of care. A person reaches for what helps them remain alive inside themselves. For me, the earliest versions of femininity were not loud declarations. They were forms of emotional first aid. As I grew older, pressure changed its clothes, but it never disappeared. Childhood rules turned into teenage expectations. Be tougher. Be simpler. Be less sensitive. Want less beauty. Need less comfort. Speak with certainty even when you are scared. Do not linger over details. Do not make your life too delicate. I heard those rules even when nobody said them aloud. Especially then. So I built my inner life in secret. Not because secrecy thrilled me, but because privacy protected me. In private, I could be intentional. In private, I could move slowly. In private, I could stop performing the version of myself that made everyone else comfortable. I did not yet understand that this private self was teaching me how to survive adulthood. I only knew that after certain rituals, I could breathe more deeply. My shoulders would drop. My thoughts would stop running in circles. The ache of being watched would loosen for a little while. That was the earliest form of what I now call gentle transformation. Not changing my body, not inventing a persona, not playing a role. It was the quiet discipline of treating myself with softness before the world could strip softness away. And once I learned that, even in fragments, I could never fully forget it. Teenage years made everything more confusing because that is when the world expects certainty from people who are still made of weather. Everyone around me seemed to be learning how to become themselves in public. Their tastes sharpened, their voices settled, their friendships became declarations. Their confidence, even when exaggerated, looked convincing from a distance. Meanwhile, I was becoming more private, more observant, more skilled at hiding how much effort it took for me to appear ordinary. What I lacked in certainty, I made up for in routine. Routine is underrated when you are trying not to fall apart. People talk about passion, ambition, boldness, reinvention. They do not talk enough about the mercy of repetition, about how a repeated act can become a handrail. At that age, I began depending on small evening rituals more than I depended on language. When the day had left me feeling scraped thin, I would return to my room and restore order in stages. I would put things back where they belonged. I would dim the lights. I would wash my face as though I were rinsing off not dirt, but static. I would choose what to wear in private with more thought than I ever gave to public clothes. Not because I was vain, because I was trying to come back to myself. That distinction mattered. Outside, clothing was armor. It was camouflage. It was compliance. Inside, it became conversation. A way of asking my own body, what would make this evening feel easier to live through? Sometimes the answer was softness. Sometimes it was neatness. Sometimes it was the comfort of looking in the mirror and seeing not a lie, but a reduction in conflict. I still did not rush to name any of it. Labels felt dangerous then. They sounded like doors that locked from both sides. I did not want to trap myself with a word before I fully understood what I was carrying. So I focused on the effect instead. Did this make the noise in my mind quieter? Did this help me feel less lonely in my own skin? Did this allow me, for even half an hour, to exist without that constant internal flinch? If the answer was yes, I returned to it. School life taught me performance. Private life taught me repair. That was the split I lived with. In public, I learned timing, humor, restraint. I learned how to say enough without saying anything real. I learned how to survive conversations that treated masculinity like an assignment everyone had agreed to complete. In private, I was learning something radically different. I was learning that care could be a practice, that gentleness could be trained. That grace was not something you were born with or denied forever. Sometimes grace was simply what happened when nobody was demanding a version of you that hurt to maintain. The loneliness of that period was not only about being misunderstood. It was also about being unshared. There are parts of yourself that become heavy simply because no one else is helping carry them. I had no dramatic secret life, nothing glamorous or reckless. I had stillness. I had drawers organized with intention. I had the relief of textures and silhouettes that allowed me to stop feeling so blunt, so cornered. I had the strange comfort of becoming softer in private after spending all day being told, directly or indirectly, to be harder. That is when I understood something important. The transformation was not in the clothes themselves. It was in the behavior surrounding them. It was in the patience, in the slowness, in the refusal to handle myself roughly. Gentle transformation was never about putting on an outfit and pretending. It was about practicing a different relationship with my own existence. I stopped treating my body like a problem to solve and started treating it like a life to care for. That shift was subtle, but it changed everything. Even on the nights when I still felt confused, I began to sense that my private rituals were not embarrassing detours. They were survival skills. There were difficult days, of course. Days when shame came rushing back for no clear reason. Days when I stood in front of the mirror and saw only contradiction. Days when I worried that all this tenderness was making me weaker, stranger, less equipped for the real world. But the older I became, the more I noticed the opposite. The world had plenty of hardness. Hardness was not rare. What was rare was the ability to remain kind to yourself while living under pressure. What was rare was knowing how to self-soothe without numbing out, lashing out, or disappearing entirely. My routines did not solve everything. They did not erase fear. They did not answer every question about who I was or what my future would become. But they gave me continuity. They gave me a thread. On days when I felt fragmented, I could return to the same careful sequence and remember that there was at least one place in life where I did not have to be at war with myself. And maybe that is what maturity begins as. Not confidence, but consistency. Not certainty, but a dependable kindness you can offer yourself when certainty is unavailable. By the end of those years, I still looked ordinary from the outside. That was the irony. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one would have called my life transformed, but inside, a philosophy had already taken root. I was discovering that femininity, for me, lived first in the quality of attention, in how gently I prepared for rest, in how mindfully I moved through private hours, in how carefully I allowed softness back into a life that had taught me to distrust it. The world saw hesitation. I saw a method. Adulthood did not arrive like freedom. It arrived like responsibility, with fluorescent lighting. Jobs, bills, schedules, performance reviews, crowded commutes, polite conversations that left no trace of warmth. I had imagined when I was younger that growing up might resolve me somehow, that independence would automatically produce clarity. Instead, adulthood revealed how easy it is to become efficient and emotionally neglected at the same time. For a while, I threw myself into being functional. It seemed safer. Wake up, work, answer messages, meet deadlines, return home tired, repeat. There is a version of loneliness that becomes sharper in adulthood because nobody notices it if you remain reliable. If you are on time, if you smile enough, if you manage your own crisis privately, people assume you are doing well. Competence becomes a costume others trust without looking underneath. My private life became even more important then. Not more dramatic, more necessary. The older I got, the more I understood that my evenings were not empty space after the real day. They were the part of life where I was rebuilding what the day had taken. I began to protect that time. I stopped treating my routines like guilty indulgences and started seeing them as maintenance of the soul. I would come home carrying the residue of noise, pressure, and self-control. Then I would begin the process of softening. Change the lighting. Change the pace. Change the way I spoke to myself internally. Put the day away, piece by piece. This was when the phrase gentle transformation fully formed in my mind, because by then I could see the pattern. Whenever life became too sharp, I did not reach for destruction. I reached for refinement. I did not want to explode. I wanted to ease, to align, to recover a version of myself that felt breathable. Some people drink heavily, some disappear into distraction, some go numb in front of a screen until midnight. I learned to return to ritual, to cleanliness, to presentation, to a softness that made private existence feel inhabitable again. I paid attention to detail because detail calmed me. A brushed fabric, a balanced color, a face washed with care rather than haste, nails trimmed neatly, hair arranged with patience even if no one would ever see, a room made orderly enough to feel safe. These acts may sound small to someone who has never needed them, but small things can hold a life together, especially when the outer world praises endurance while quietly draining the person doing the enduring. It was also during that phase that I stopped seeing femininity as something external that I was borrowing. That idea had caused too much pain. Borrowing implies distance.
Costume.
Temporary permission. But what I was feeling was not borrowed. The relief was too deep. The peace was too honest. The stillness that came over me in those private hours was not performance. It was recognition. Not perfect recognition. Not complete. But real enough that I could no longer dismiss it. And yet, I remained careful. Not because the feeling lacked truth, but because truth does not erase risk. The world can be unkind to anything it does not immediately categorize. I knew that. I had always known that. So my transformation stayed gentle not only in style, but in strategy. I was never trying to shock anyone. I was trying to preserve something fragile and necessary inside myself. A private garden does not become less real because it grows behind a wall. Sometimes I would look back at my younger self and feel tenderness for how hard he had tried to survive without language. He had thought that the goal was to become less sensitive, less affected, less needy. But adulthood taught me the opposite lesson. The goal was not to feel less. The goal was to care for what I felt in a way that did not destroy me. That realization changed how I moved through everything, even beyond clothing or presentation. I became more deliberate with my home, more selective with my company, more aware of which conversations left me hollow and which left me human. Gentle transformation became a principle I could apply to my whole life.
Do not force.
Do not brutalize. Do not rush yourself into shapes that cost too much to maintain. Approach with care. Adjust gradually. Let peace become a practice, not a prize. There were still lonely nights.
Plenty of them.
Nights when the silence felt heavy instead of healing. Nights when I wondered whether anyone would ever understand the emotional logic of what I was doing. Nights when I feared I might spend my entire life translating myself only halfway, always understood in fragments, never in full. But even then, I noticed something important. I was no longer ashamed of the tenderness that sustained me.
Protective, yes.
Private, often. But not ashamed. That was growth. Because once shame loosens its grip, the mirror changes. You stop looking for evidence against yourself. You stop treating your comfort like a criminal clue. You stop assuming that what eases your suffering must be silly, weak, or wrong. Instead, you begin to ask a better question. If this helps me become calmer, kinder, and more whole, why would I refuse it just to satisfy a standard that has never loved me back? That question stayed with me. And slowly, over months and years, it gave me a kind of dignity I had been searching for since childhood. Not the dignity of approval, the dignity of inner permission. By the time I understood myself more clearly, the biggest changes had already happened in invisible places. That is something people rarely talk about. They focus on visible milestones because visible things are easier to describe. But the deepest transformations often happen before anyone can point to them. They happen in how you think when you wake up, in how harshly you judge your reflection, in whether your first instinct is to correct yourself or comfort yourself. Mine had become comfort more often than not. That did not mean life became easy. Pressure still existed. Work still demanded energy I did not always have. Social spaces still carried assumptions that exhausted me. Some relationships remained surface level because surface level was safer. There were still moments when I felt split between the person others recognized and the person I had spent years quietly nurturing. But the split no longer felt like a wound all the time. Sometimes it felt like a transition in progress. A bridge rather than a fracture. What changed was the quality of my inner voice. When I was younger, that voice had been anxious, corrective, even punitive. Be careful. Hide better. Don't get caught feeling too much. Don't make this harder than it already is. But after years of private care, another voice grew stronger, slower,
Softer.
more feminine, not because it sounded a certain way, but because it held me a certain way. It said, "Take your time. You do not need to punish yourself into being acceptable. You are allowed to create peace before you earn it. You are allowed to be gentle, even if the world mistakes gentleness for weakness." That voice changed the whole atmosphere of my life. I stopped treating my routines as emergency measures and started treating them as expressions of identity. Preparing carefully for the evening, choosing softness, paying attention to posture, to grace, to stillness, to kindness in motion, these were no longer just tools for surviving bad days. They were ways of living truthfully on ordinary days. That difference matters. Survival says, "I need this because I am breaking." Identity says, "I choose this because it is me." Even then, I did not need everything to become public in order for it to become real. Some people equate authenticity with visibility, but I learned that authenticity begins much earlier than disclosure. It begins in honesty with yourself, in stopping the endless internal argument, in no longer demanding a courtroom level of evidence before allowing yourself simple relief. There were evenings when I would sit quietly after finishing my routine, not doing anything special, just existing in the calm I had created, and I would realize how foreign calm used to feel. As a child, I thought safety meant avoiding trouble. As an adult, I learned that safety also means making home inside yourself. Not a perfect home, not a final home, but one with enough warmth that you do not dread returning there. Gentle transformation gave me that. It taught me that femininity in my life was not only about appearance. It was about care, ethics, about how I handled exhaustion, about how I arranged my environment so that my nervous system could unclench, about how I let beauty enter quietly through order, softness, fragrance, patience, and restraint, about how I learned to move away from self-contempt and toward self-regard. That shift also affected how I saw other people. Pain had made me observant. Healing made me compassionate. I became slower to mock what I did not understand, slower to assume that someone else's private rituals were frivolous. Everyone is trying to survive something.
Some do it loudly.
Some do it behind perfect manners and clean shirts and small smiles. Once I understood my own hidden methods of survival, I became more respectful of the invisible lives around me. And yes, there was grief in this stage too. Grief for lost time. For younger versions of myself who had needed comfort and found only secrecy. For all the energy spent trying to appear uncomplicated. For the years when I confused numbness with strength. But grief, when held gently, can become wisdom instead of bitterness. I did not want to resent my past forever. I wanted to bless it if I could. To look back and say, you were doing your best with the tools you had. The softness you wanted was never foolish. It was medicine. That understanding brought an unexpected kind of maturity. Not loud confidence. Not total certainty. Something steadier. A willingness to live with nuance. To accept that my story did not need to fit neatly into other people's categories to be valid. To let my transformation remain what it had always been at heart. Careful, intimate, and deeply human. By then, the secret was no longer that I had changed. The secret was how much of that change had happened through kindness instead of crisis. If I were to explain my life now, I would not begin with clothes. I would not begin with labels or milestones, or the moments that seemed dramatic enough to satisfy other people's curiosity. I would begin with pressure, with loneliness, with the quiet ways a person can disappear from themselves while still showing up everywhere they are expected to be. Then I would talk about care, because care is what brought me back. Not all at once, not with fanfare, just little by little over years. A different way of preparing for the night, a different standard for how I allowed myself to be treated by my own mind. A refusal to keep using hardness as the price of belonging. What began as private comfort slowly became philosophy. What began as routine became language. What began as survival became peace. There was never one single event that transformed me. No sudden permission. No perfect answer arriving on time. Instead, I changed through repetition. Through returning to what calmed me. Through learning that presentation can be prayer when it is done with sincerity. Through discovering that softness is not the opposite of strength. Sometimes it is the most durable form of strength a person can build. I still remember the old fear that if I let myself become too gentle, I would fall apart. The truth was the opposite. Gentleness held me together. Harshness had only ever made me splinter more quietly. The more respectfully I treated my own inner life, the less chaotic it became. The more patience I brought to my reflection, the less I needed to fight it. The more carefully I practiced femininity in private, the more I understood it was not a performance I was creating, but a truth I was allowing. That is why I no longer think of my story as one of hiding. Not entirely. Yes, there were secrets. Yes, there were years of privacy, caution, and silence. But beneath all of that, there was also devotion. A steady devotion to becoming someone I could live with peacefully. Someone who did not need to dominate himself in order to deserve a place in the world. And maybe that is the clearest thing I know now. The self does not always arrive through conquest. Sometimes the self arrives through care. Through laundry folded with attention. Through skincare done slowly after a difficult day. Through a room arranged to feel safe. Through choosing softness when no one is watching. through the quiet relief of seeing your reflection and feeling less conflict than you did yesterday. That is what gentle transformation means to me. Not becoming unreal, not escaping reality, but meeting reality with enough grace that it does not erase you. It means allowing femininity to begin in behavior, in rhythm, in mercy. It means understanding that the most private acts of self-expression can also be the most stabilizing. It means accepting that survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like composure. Sometimes it looks like elegance. Sometimes it looks like taking better care of yourself than the world ever taught you to. I do not have all the answers even now. My life is still unfolding. There are still conversations I may have one day, still layers of self-understanding that may deepen with time. But the panic is gone. The war is quieter. The mirror is no longer a courtroom. Home is no longer a place I hope to reach someday after becoming acceptable enough. Home is something I have started building from within. That is peace, I think. Not perfection. Not certainty.
Peace.
The kind that comes when your inner life is no longer begging to be rescued from you. The kind that comes when you stop asking whether softness is allowed and begin living as though it always was. The kind that comes when you realize the secret was never that you were becoming someone else. The secret was that, all along, you were learning how to be gentle enough to finally become yourself. And in that understanding, I found emotional clarity.